So once again, hello everybody, a warm welcome to all of you who are attending our webinar. My name is Ena, and tonight or today, depending on where you are currently based, we will be talking about crisis leadership during the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, this year has been very challenging from multiple angles, but one of the things that keeps popping up as very important and very crucial for the survival of this year is crisis leadership. Today, we will not be talking about the leadership of particular governments or countries. We will be talking about business leaders who dealt with the crisis in their own organization in the best or worst way possible. So we'll look at some of the positive examples as well as name some of the negative ones, and in general talk about what it means to be a good crisis leader in a crisis that is similar or the same as the one we faced this year. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I hope you will enjoy the webinar and find it useful. If you have any questions or if you have any thoughts that you would like to share, feel free to type them in the chat box. However, I will be addressing them at the end of the webinar, so please be patient until then. And for any additional questions or remarks that you would like to share, please feel free to contact info@edueffective.online, and we will get back to you. So to start, I first want to introduce you with what we will be talking about. We will talk about what constitutes a crisis in general. Then we will define crisis leadership. Then we will talk about the differences between crisis management and crisis leadership, because these are different concepts which are sometimes confused. Then we will talk about how COVID-19 crisis was special and why was it special, because it has been a crisis that hasn't been seen by the world in decades, if not even centuries. Then we will mention what are the crisis leadership principles that a crisis leader should follow during the crisis. We will talk briefly about crisis communication as a crucial part of the process. And then obviously we will share the examples, concrete examples of business leaders, CEOs, or other types of leaders at their positions who dealt with the crisis in their own way. And these examples will show some good and some bad behaviors, or some behaviors that you can learn from in any case, whether to replicate them or to avoid them if you are ever in that situation. And lastly, we will conclude with the general topics of the webinar, and I hope that you will again find it useful and enjoy it. So, interestingly enough, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is actually composed of two characters. As you know, Chinese language has a very specific alphabet that they use, and the letters or the characters actually that they use are very different from the ones that we use in the Latin alphabet. And when you write the word crisis in Chinese characters, it's actually composed of two characters, one representing danger and one representing opportunity. So I'm going to pause here for a bit just for you to understand it a bit and for it to sink in. This is the twofold nature of any crisis, not just COVID-19, obviously, but any crisis in general, that as much as it is a danger and as much as it is a challenge and something to overcome, it also represents a hidden opportunity, because everything that can happen from that crisis can go both ways. It can go in a good way or in a bad way. And there are so many examples where companies, people, or governments have taken the advantage of surviving the crisis and coming out on the other side stronger than ever, using the potential that every crisis hides, and then obviously improving their business or their operations based on that. So that's very interesting to understand, that crisis as such is not should not be seen in just the negative context, and this is obviously shown in this interpretation as well, where we see the twofold nature of crisis. So, what constitutes a crisis in general? I'm sure that you've all heard or seen or witnessed or participated in a crisis event. We're going to focus on crises that happen in the management or in the business world, not crisis in general, but specifically in the business world and in the business sphere. So for that particular world, a crisis is any event that is going to lead to an unstable and dangerous situation that affects an individual, group, community, or even the whole society. And it's very important to understand that it's a specific and unexpected event. It's not something that happens routinely, or it's not something that happens that we expect it to happen. And it creates high levels of uncertainty and threat that affect the organization's priority goals. As most of you know, uncertainty is one of the things that every business has to deal with, and it's very difficult. So crisis is an event that actually contributes to the levels of uncertainty, which make it very difficult and challenging to operate the business. Crisis can also be seen as a change, either sudden or evolving, and it results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. Oftentimes, even during this year, you've seen that there's no time to think, there's no time to dwell on what's happening, but you just need to react, because crisis has a nature of being so dynamic and so quick that you simply have to react at that very moment. So for a business, a crisis is anything with the potential to cause sudden and serious damage to the employees, to the reputation, or the so-called bottom line of the business, which you all know from your studies and from your education. Every organization goes through some form of a crisis on a fairly regular basis. So there is no stable business environment anymore, and there is no organization today that hasn't dealt with a crisis in some shape or form in their lifetime. So it can be a small crisis that goes away very quickly, or it can be a major crisis that actually is a game changer for the entire business. But what you need to understand is that there is no such thing as a fixed, stable environment where there are no crisis events at all. There's always something to deal with, and there's always crisis happening regularly, because that's just the nature of the world we live in. And obviously, crises happen quickly without a warning. So there is no such thing as somebody phoning you and telling you, oh, you have a crisis coming in a month, so better be prepared. All we can do is be prepared at any point in time, because we never know when the next crisis can occur. So when we talk about crisis in general, I just want to highlight all the possible events that could constitute a crisis. Obviously, today we will be talking about the specific crisis that we were all hit by during this year, which is the COVID-19 crisis. But apart from that, in order for you to understand why crisis management has so many applicable areas, we will talk about which other events can be seen as a crisis event. So it can be a natural disaster, such as an earthquake, floods, etc. Product recall as well. So let's say that your organization has a product that has been known to have a defect, and obviously because of the market reaction, you have to recall the entire product from the market, and that brings you significant damages to your reputation, to your bottom line, etc. Then an environmental accident, like we've seen many times in nuclear plants or something like that. Transportation accident, protests against the organization, if you are in a business that some people find dangerous or offensive, etc. Then work-related death or injury, disruptive employee, security or data breach, which is extremely common in the last, let's say, decade, because of the nature of the data and the nature of the technology that we have nowadays. Data breach is something that happens fairly regularly to most companies. Then product tampering, terrorist attack, stock issues, or corporate takeover. And you've seen this happen many times, especially, for example, in the US for the big corporations that actually are present on the stock market. So any danger and any serious event on the stock market can have major effects on the organization. Then corporate reorganization, restructuring, etc., and many others. So obviously these are just some types of a crisis, but you can think of a crisis as any event that you don't expect, that is dangerous in some way for your organization, and that needs to be dealt with. That cannot just be, oh, something that's happening out there, but it actually affects you and you have to deal with it. So crisis leadership is obviously connected to dealing with the crisis that happens to your organization or to your business. As we've said, it's an uncertain crisis is an uncertain situation that also has latent risks and opportunities that must be resolved within a given time frame. Something to think about is who is responsible for resolving a crisis in an organization. This is extremely important because we all see a crisis happening and we all know that it's happening, but sometimes it's very difficult to see who should be the one dealing with the crisis. Obviously, in most organizations, especially bigger ones, you have people in higher positions, such as CEOs, CFOs, or something like that, who are responsible for being the leader in that situation, who are responsible for giving orders, who are responsible for taking the accountability and responsibility for the decision making. But in general, all people that are involved in the organization have a level of responsibility for resolving the crisis. This means that if a person is just an employee in an organization and not the crisis leader, he or she still has a responsibility to participate in the activities that will contribute to the resolve of the crisis. So it's simply an organizational culture that needs to be installed in every organization, whereas every person involved needs to feel accountable to resolve the crisis in the way that he or she can. So there's no such thing as saying, oh, this crisis doesn't concern me, I'm just not going to do anything. It's not something that should be a part of the organizational culture. Rather, every person should feel like they need to contribute to the positive result after the crisis, and they need to participate in activities that are equivalent to their level of responsibility or to their role in the organization. So next time when you talk about crisis and in an organization, try not to think about crisis leadership as something that is specifically and exclusively limited to one person that is in a particular role. It actually spills over and includes all the people that are involved in the organization, all of its employees, all of the workers. So, in general, crisis leadership is actually a process of responding to a crisis, which is a low probability, high impact situation. And the way that this responding happens is by influencing others to overcome or take advantage of the situation, regardless of its course, and by optimizing the effect in a timely framework. Now, this is a very complex definition, but it's very good because it covers so many different aspects of what crisis leadership really is. It's not just about giving orders. As you can see here, it's about influencing others as well to participate in the whole process of resolving the crisis, as well to take advantage of the situation, not just to cover up and make sure that business is still ongoing, but to see if there is a chance to take the opportunity of this particular event. And then lastly, to optimize the effect that all of these activities can have in a timely framework, because there's no crisis that ever happened or that will ever happen that says, oh, you have all the time of the world to resolve it. It's usually very, very time limiting, and at times you have only a few hours to deal with a crisis, sometimes more, but time is of crucial importance in these cases. So there is no luxury of taking your time and deciding on these things in the long run. You have to act fast. However, during the initial phase, so let's imagine a crisis that is slightly bigger, such as the one we were facing this year. The initial phase of the crisis includes three things that require the utmost focus from the crisis leader at that point. First, securing safety. That should be the number one priority. Depending on the nature of the crisis event, this safety can be um, seen in a different format. But what's important is to ensure that all of the people working and all of the people involved in the business and in the crisis, obviously, are safe. Then second is maintaining operational continuity. That should be definitely the second priority, because crisis will pass. You need to ensure that your business continues to run the best way possible under those circumstances. You cannot stop the production or stop the business simply because a crisis is happening. You need to work around the issue and make sure that you maintain the continuity of your operations in order to have a future after that crisis. And lastly, managing cash flow. Especially for smaller organizations, it's very important to focus on this third priority, because sometimes some of the things in the crisis can have a major effect on the cash flow. And what you need to make sure is that you kind of secure that cash flow that is essential for your business and for it to be running, rather than to just focus on dealing with the crisis without looking at your assets and at your cash flow. When the revenues are adversely affected by the crisis, obviously the cash flow management is critical, whether it's a smaller or a bigger organization, and that means innovating rapidly in ways to generate new income and putting measures in place to secure staff salaries. When a crisis happens, depending on the nature of it, it can really actually give you ideas to generate new income from ways that you haven't thought of before. This happened a lot during this year, especially for organizations who haven't been forced to think outside of the box prior to it. And COVID-19 actually made them think about revenues in a different way and made them more creative in the ways that they generate the much needed income. So this income was actually needed to cover their basic operational costs and obviously the salaries of their employees. And it helped that they were able to come up with new ways rather than get stuck with the old ways that couldn't be done anymore in the same way because of the crisis that we had this year. So, crisis leadership versus crisis management is a very interesting concept, because a lot of the people mix the two, or a lot of the people don't actually understand what each is. So for the purpose of this webinar, I made a small table on the next slide where you will see the exact differences in these two concepts. But in general, to describe these two concepts, crisis management is something that happens as a reaction to the crisis, and it actually uses measures and methodologies to recognize, control, and limit the damage of the crisis and its effects. It's kind of like managing a problem in a certain way that you've already learned or that you already established from before. So you contain the problem, you either contain it, you either dismiss it, or you shovel it away. On the other side, crisis leadership is slightly more proactive. So it doesn't just react on a crisis, it actually sees the bigger picture. So when we talk about the difference between crisis leadership and crisis management, many of you might actually remember the difference between management and leadership in general. And here you will see much of the same comparison and much of the same differences that we have. So it follows the same logic that management and leadership are not the same thing. So crisis leadership actually recognizes uncertain situations that possess both risks and opportunities, then chooses the necessary direction of action, makes critical decisions, and finally influences the parties involved to move towards eliminating the negative impact of that crisis. This is very important, as we talked in the beginning, where it's not just about addressing the problem, it's about influencing the people involved and all the parties involved in order to help mitigate the risk, help bridge that gap between the negative current situation and the positive future that we all look forward to. Then obviously what one must must not forget is that we cannot just have crisis leaders or just have crisis managers. Every organization needs both. Whether it comes from the same person who sometimes uses one approach and then the other, or whether it comes from different people who are more crisis leaders and the others who are more crisis managers. But one does not go without the other. Why is that? Because the most effective leaders in a crisis need to ensure that someone else is managing the problem and managing the present time while they focus the attention on leading and going towards the future. So as you might know from management, so managers are the ones who focus on the present, who focus on what's going on now, whereas leaders are the ones who think beyond that, who are focused on the future and who see kind of like above that present and see what's ahead of them. So one has to complement the other, and you have to have a balanced approach between these two in order to address the crisis effectively. And here, as I said, here is a small table that actually summarizes the basic differences between the two. Although both of these concepts deal with a crisis, so it's the same, let's say, focus, they deal with it in a slightly different way. Crisis leadership has a long-term perspective, as we just said. It looks beyond the present, it looks towards the future, it sees the bigger picture. Crisis management has a short-term perspective. Let's deal with the situation now, let's fix what we can right now, and let's just make sure that we kind of cover up what's going on right now. Crisis leadership is proactive, meaning it looks towards the future again, and it is proactive in the ways that it addresses the problem, whereas crisis management is just reactive. It simply reacts to what happened, and it uses those principles and guidelines that have already been established. Crisis leadership, having the big picture in mind, also learns from crisis and mistakes, whereas crisis management doesn't necessarily need to learn. It just responds to the crisis and moves on because there's so many other things that need to be managed. Crisis leadership is guided by principles and values, but crisis management is guided by protocols and standardized methods. Many organizations have a crisis management plan in place. It's difficult to have a crisis leadership plan in place because you cannot plan for principles and values and a lot of these things that happen actually at that moment. But for crisis management, it's a lot easier in that sense where you can anticipate what might happen and you can anticipate what kind of guidelines, protocols, or standardized methods, or SOPs as they call them, so standard operating procedure, you can have established even before the crisis happens so that you can use them when that crisis happens. This is especially true for, let's say, smaller crises, whereas, for example, for bigger ones, it's more difficult. So let's say, for example, if you anticipate or if you know that in the future you might have a data breach, which most of the organizations nowadays to some extent can anticipate. And this is something that's relatively easy to imagine. The problem with the crisis this year was that nobody could imagine the scale or the nature of the crisis that we went through. But a data breach is something that is relatively easy to imagine. And for an organization, they can picture to themselves what might happen if, say, somebody gets a hold of our confidential data about our clients. What should we do? And you're thinking in advance, you're preparing protocols, and you're preparing some SOPs that can be ready to use when that thing happens. This is not the same as crisis leadership. Crisis leadership actually reacts or deals with that particular situation in the long run, rather than using SOPs or standards that were developed before. So that's a very big difference between the two. And then crisis leadership, the focus here is on goals, whereas in crisis management, the focus is on tasks. And lastly, obviously, crisis leadership is leading to a crisis, and crisis management is managing the response. So I think it's very important to understand these concepts, as I said, from the general point of view as well, so leadership versus management in general, and then it will be much more clear on what a crisis leadership is, whereas and how it is different from crisis management. And Obviously, we all expected a wonderful year in 2020 because the world was really, more or less stable before this, and we had a lot of crisis management plans in place. And especially for business, we thought we knew it all. But COVID-19 pandemic emerged as an unprecedented international humanitarian crisis that the world has not seen so far. And leading through the acute COVID-19 crisis was a major stress test for leaders of any kind, right? Whether it was a leader of an organization, of a country, of a family. So it was very stressful for each of these units. And what was interesting that we saw is the crisis challenged all the companies, all the businesses, all the industries, even those that had a solid crisis management plan in place. Why? You might ask, how could we not have something in place to help us be prepared for something like this? So I'm sure that many of you maybe even asked yourself this question during this year, or you might be wondering now. But now we're going to see why this particular crisis of COVID-19 was stressful even for those that were most prepared. So, as you know, and as we said, COVID-19 pandemic is or was and is the defining global health crisis of our time and the greatest challenge we have faced since World War II, interestingly enough. Even today, situations are still changing rapidly, and why a management plan or a crisis management plan was not sufficient is because a rigid plan was not responding well to the overall changing situation from day to day. Also, the crisis has a degree of severity which transcends most of the scenarios that were previously envisioned. This means that maybe just a few people in this world could have imagined a crisis like this and the scale of it before it started happening. So that's why it was very difficult to have a plan in place that would respond to something that we previously did not even imagine happening. So that's why, as I said, if a crisis that we talk about is something that we can imagine, we can have a plan in place. But if it's something that we absolutely cannot imagine or cannot think it is possible to happen, then we wouldn't have a plan in place. The key areas which presented challenges for both crisis leadership and crisis management were and still are getting reliable information and intelligence. I think this year proved so much that fake news, fake info, insufficient info, incomplete info, etc., play a major role in bad decisions. So it was very challenging to get the reliable information and as well the correct information that will help in the decision making, because if you have bad information to start with, you will end up with bad decision making. Then the velocity of the crisis, I think nobody could have expected this. Understanding the whole ecosystem. This is also very peculiar for this crisis because it's not a single event affecting one single part of the business. It's affecting almost all parts of the business and people and their lives. So understanding the whole situation in a holistic matter was very difficult because maybe a particular decision was good for one side of the business, but not for the other. And it was very difficult, and it still is, to put those in peace and to make sense of it. And lastly, coping with uncertainty. Uncertainty is probably the most challenging part of leading a business. And during this year, the uncertainty levels rose sky high. So coping with that and making decisions without knowing what might happen next month or even next day is extremely stressful for leaders of any kind, because you have to be accountable and responsible for the decision that you are making, but at the same time you cannot envision in your head what's going to be happening, and you're not certain of whether or not things will be better or at least different in the next period of time. So these are just some general areas that were really crucial for making this crisis different than any other. We're going to go through some others more now. One of the things that we've learned this year as well is that perfection is the enemy of good. It's easy to wait for more information before making any decision, but that is counterproductive and actually leads to chaos. Decisions needed to be made fast and often. Any leader in a crisis will tell you that you don't have time to think that much. You need to act fast and you cannot have all the info that you would want. It's not idealist. It's not a utopian scenario where you have all the information and you know everything before making a decision. It's the nature of a crisis where you have to work with what you have and you need to make those decisions fast without waiting for everything to be perfect or to have all the info before doing something. Then good leaders recognize that they need to focus on employees, trust, delegation, and engagement. This crisis actually helped everybody to kind of come back to their core values and to their guiding principles of why they are in business in the first place. And those guiding principles actually help them focus on the right things. So especially in this extreme crisis, business has an ethical and moral imperative to do the right thing for the society at large, which kind of transcends corporate or even selfish interests in the perfect world. Obviously, we've seen mistakes even in this year where leaders acted in their selfish interest or in their corporate interest on the expense of the health or safety of the overall society or their employees, which is not supposed to be the case. So crises like these should actually help the businesses kind of reset and go back to basics and remember why they are doing what they are doing in the first place. And that brings you to focus on those key elements like employees, trust, delegation, and engagement. And while it sometimes can be hard to maintain a positive attitude, particularly during an event like a crisis, good business leaders emphasize the importance of positivity. It doesn't mean false optimism. It doesn't mean lying to the public or lying to our employees or lying to the society or whatever. It's about acknowledging that things are bad at this moment, but also noting that crisis does not last forever. Better times will come and we will go out of this stronger. So having a positive attitude does not mean being happy all the time, does not mean sharing fake news, does not mean not acknowledging that a crisis is happening or just telling your employees to shake it off or something. It's about accepting the situation, acknowledging that it is bad, but ending with a note of positive light at the end of the tunnel, which says that it's bad now, but it won't be like this forever. And let's all hope for the better times and prepare for those better times because they will certainly come, which is true. No crisis ever lasted forever, so this one will pass as well. And we need to still keep that optimism because a good leader has to be inspiring to its employees and to the groups of people that he's influencing. And now, something in general about crisis leadership principles that should be followed in any crisis and that were followed by good leaders during the crisis of COVID-19. These are communication, core values, realism, decision-making, encouragement, optimism, and humanism. We're going to go through all of these one by one, and maybe it will help you remember examples of leaders from your environment or from the news or from your general knowledge that used some of these principles in their way of dealing with the crisis. So the first principle is communication. We're going to talk about crisis communication a little bit later in particular, but as you probably know, communication is the main pillar of leadership because you absolutely need to be a good communicator in order to be a good leader. With an overload of information, what you need to make sure is that you communicate effectively. Because you are the one defining the reality with the information that you are sharing, and you are the one reinforcing a clear perspective on what is happening and what it means for the business. Leaders in an organization need to ensure that they are sharing or that they are communicating in the best way possible, because they are the ones that the employees trust. And they're the ones who say, who define the reality as it's stated here. So they are the ones who say if a situation is good or bad, or very good or very bad. Communication needs to be clear and consistent, but it also needs to be adaptive. There's no harm in admitting that you were wrong yesterday because you had the wrong information. There is harm in sticking to your story stubbornly because you are afraid to say, I was wrong yesterday. It's simply counterproductive, and a good leader must always remember to be adaptive with the communication, along with the changing information that keep coming every day or every period of time. And then good leaders look outward to colleagues, employees, suppliers, and customers, as well as other organizations in their environment, for gathering the insight required to enable better decision making. No man is an island, no business is an island, and by that default, no leader knows everything on their own. A good leader actually surrounds himself or herself with with people who have good knowledge and who have sometimes even a different opinion, because that helps understand things from different perspectives. And involving partners that are included in your business process, such as customers or suppliers, gives an additional level of trust and strengthens the ties that you have with your partners, because a crisis affects everybody. This crisis affected a business, its customers, and its suppliers. So reaching out to them for information, for advice, for consult can only do good rather than bad. Then realism. Leaders should provide a realistic view of the current state with optimism for the future. This is what I talked about before. So you need to be realistic about what's happening, acknowledging if things are bad, but then ending it with an optimistic note. It's also very important to understand that being a good leader in good times, it's easy. Being a good leader in bad times, it's very difficult. And everybody shines when things are good because there's nothing to be concerned with. But when things are bad, good leaders actually have a very high degree of accountability for the challenges and for delivering bad news. So maybe some of you think that, I could be a leader because it's just about inspiring people and influencing them and leading them through the small challenges that they face. Actually, it's so much more than that, because those good leaders that we recognize as good are the ones who shine in very, very bad events, such as a crisis. So increasing your credibility and allowing them to share an optimistic vision is both reassuring and realistic. Then we move on to humanism. I think this is part of the ethical business that is an imperative nowadays, and that is something that is really starting to be a norm in the business, that it's not just about the numbers, but that we all need to remember that there are people that are affected by every decision or every action that a business makes. And great leaders are those who engage purposefully with those around them. And this engagement creates a sense of togetherness by having a humility to listen to a wide range of opinions and focus on asking questions. There's no time for finger pointing, blaming, and dwelling on mistakes worse than a crisis. When a crisis is happening, you have absolutely no use of pointing a finger to somebody and saying, this is your fault. You didn't prepare us for this disaster, so this is all your fault that we are going through this. It's absolutely not a good use of time. These things should be addressed after the crisis, but during the crisis, you just need to remember that you are all in it together as humans, as parts of an organization, and as a unity that needs to go through it together. And obviously, a good leader acts ethically and in the best interest of the entire society, and not just of himself or herself. Okay, and moving on. Focus on core values. As I said before, a crisis is actually the opportunity to reset and rediscover your core values. Why are you in the business in the first place? What are your guiding principles, and what is the main set of values that actually brought you to the business in the first place? And those are the same ones that will keep you in the business during the crisis. It also means recognizing everybody's inputs and hard work. Um, Especially if a crisis means that everybody has their own role and their own activities, it's very important as a leader to be the one encouraging people to do more and recognizing and rewarding the good effort. Then decision making in ambiguity. Decision making is a pillar of leadership in general, and it's something that is extremely complex and can require, multiple years, many years of studying and practicing before getting better at it. There's no such thing as a perfect leader or a perfect decision maker. There's only those who adapt better or who learn more and more and become better, but never perfect. Especially during a crisis, it's impossible to have decision making that is perfect and without a flaw. So a leader needs to accept that there will be conflicting data, conflicting opinions. There will be, many different areas that are not clear, but they still need to make a decision in that atmosphere and in that cycle and circle. So what they need to do is quickly develop and communicate a point of view on the best path forward, providing a sense of direction. So it's not just about saying you need to do that and you need to do this. The good leader looks at the overall picture, makes sure what's the direction that he wants or she wants the company to take, and then adapting all the decisions to that, and then obviously informing the people who are doing things, why are they doing them and why did he or she make that decision. But as I said before, things in a crisis change rapidly, and a situation can be extremely different from one day to another. So a good leader also needs to be flexible in redirecting that course. Maybe today, I, as a leader, thought that this path is going to be the best for our business. But tomorrow I will think differently because I have new information. I need to be humble enough to accept that I was wrong yesterday, redirect my business, change the course, and then change the decisions. So it's about balancing between sticking to what you think is right, but also acknowledging that you might be wrong and that you might have been wrong yesterday and that you need to adapt based on the new situation. Encouragement is also extremely important, as many of you know, if not all, who've ever been part of an organization. People strive under positive enforcement and under encouragement. So leaders are actually the ones who inspire and encourage others to become a catalyst for widespread change and not just operators or executors. A manager is somebody who tells you, do A and B. A leader is somebody who encourages you to think about what you should do, why you should do it, and should you choose A or B, and then ultimately choosing those. So a leader is the one who encourages its employees to actually think about what they are doing and why, rather than just execute it and say, okay, I've done my job. Especially in times of a crisis, there's no time for a very big hierarchy in the decision making, because that just slows down the process and slows down the reaction or the response to the crisis. So during the crisis, a lot of the times it happens that the leadership structure is temporarily flattened, which means that there's no time to go through 5 levels of management to get an approval for a decision. The hierarchy needs to be flattened enough so that everybody is more or less on the same level, and that the reaction to the crisis can happen quickly. That is called agile leadership, or more horizontal leadership, which means that the curve is flattening. And obviously, as I mentioned before, already 2 times, I guess, it's optimism. Again, it doesn't mean false optimism. It doesn't mean denying realities. It just means acknowledging that the crisis is here. It's bad now, but it won't be like that forever, and that we need to look forward to better times and prepare for those better times. It's not just about addressing the bad things right now. It's also about preparing yourself to be able to work normally, so to say, when the crisis is over. And as I promised before, we're going to talk specifically about crisis communication now, because that is the main pillar of crisis leadership. A leader's success under crisis is largely dependent on their ability to process information, act on it, and influence others to act on it as well, within the organization as well as outside of it, including customers, partners, etc. In the crisis, leaders collect and assess multiple pieces of information that come from very different sources, and they also need to be mindful of their own individual biases that may affect this process. A lot of the times, when a crisis deals with something that is close to our heart, so to say, it is possible to have a biased opinion, even if you are the best leader that has been doing the best things for his or her business for the number of years before. During this year, there have been a lot of controversial opinions about a lot of things, because this crisis dealt with health and safety. And these are things that are obviously one of those main pillars of our lives, and we all have a specific attitude, belief, or opinion on these things, whether a certain group of people should have a priority in accessing health services or not, whether we should be all locked in the houses, or we should have some level of freedom and go out, whether the government should be the one deciding if we should be having contact with other people or not, etc., etc. So all of these things, actually, it's normal and logical that we all have our own opinion about all of these things. Leaders are humans as well, as we all are, so they have their own opinion as well. What a good leader needs to do is ensure that his or her own biases don't get in the way of making the right decision for their business. It's extremely hard to get there, because we don't necessarily notice these biases because we are thinking with our own head. But it's good to have a third or fourth or second opinion from the side, who actually can point out that sometimes we might be blinded by our own biases, and that the priority in the case of decision making should be the benefit and the health of the business or the large society, rather than acting according to our own opinion, belief, or attitude. And as I said before, decisions in a crisis, especially in this crisis, needed to be made based on imperfect information, and they involve higher stakes. So making a decision in, let's say, normal times might not include high stakes like during the crisis. And considering the urgency of the situation, they must be made quickly and without hesitation. Those leaders that are recognized as good leaders are the ones who are able to quickly process an information that comes to them, quickly realize what effect it has on the business, and act on it without hesitation, rather than sit down and think about it for hours, doing scenarios in their head and weighing what the decision could be. Sometimes it really requires strong will and no hesitation in the decision making. A lot of the times, people can freeze under the pressure, especially in crisis, when you know things are happening, when you are under stress as it is, etc., and you might act impulsively. But leaders are the ones who need to keep their head cold, and who need to methodically generate response options, to create the criteria to evaluate these responses and then take action. Leaders should not be acting impulsively. Leaders should not be acting based on their reflex when they hear an information, but they need to train their mind, and this comes obviously with years of practice, to actually do a quick decision making based on the criteria and evaluation in their head before taking an action, but with a cold head, rather than being too stressed or too much under pressure to make the decision. And as you know, corporate reputations can be built or destroyed during the crisis. We've seen this happen many, many times. And we've seen during this year how some companies actually collapsed under the pressure, and their corporate reputations just went out of the window, probably never to return again. So this also means that the higher stakes that we have require better decision making from any leader that is in the particular business. Organization members and stakeholders are likely to experience extreme emotional reactions and sometimes even develop different interpretation of events. This is very normal, especially in this year. We've seen that the crisis actually affected the mental health of many, many people in the world, including those working for a particular business. So a leader, obviously, a leader is not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist of any kind, but he or she needs to have and needs to work on improving their level of emotional intelligence that is actually able, that gives them the ability to effectively manage the expectations, emotions, and to guarantee cohesive action and good communication flow. Leaders are the ones who deal with people's reactions on a daily basis. And during the times of crisis, they are the ones who need to recognize those people who actually need more help, who need more encouragement, or who need something very different than what they can give them in order to act alongside with everybody else in the business. Leaders need to show empathy and to signal that they are attentive and concerned with people's distress and that they are taking measures to support them. Some of the best examples of good leaders during this year, which we will see later in the presentation, include those leaders who actually recognized the pain, the disappointment, and the suffering of people during this crisis. It doesn't necessarily mean that a leader can solve all the problems of that person, but offering empathy, recognizing it, understanding it, and to some extent, making sure that the person knows that they will do whatever it takes to help them makes a huge difference. That is the difference between a good leader and a bad leader. A bad leader simply won't care about people's reactions and will be focused just on the operational continuity and not care about how the people in the business react. In the long run, that is a big mistake because people stay because of good leaders, because of good organizational culture, because of something that was done at the time when not many people would do something. So investing in emotional intelligence towards your employees is something that makes you a good leader and ensures that your business will have the best talent in the long run and the best people that work for you. So in general, the guidelines for crisis communication are communicate more rather than less, sooner rather than later. It's better to over-communicate rather to under-communicate in these times, because when people are left in some kind of ambiguity and some kind of dark, they start questioning, they start doubting their leader, and they start being even more afraid. When their leader in the organization repeats the same information a few times, they feel more secure and they feel like they can trust this person because they are doing everything that they can. Reinforce shared values and purpose. As I said, core values are the ones that brought you to the business. They are the ones that will keep you in the business. Acknowledge and appreciate the team's experience. Always try to recognize the efforts and always try to be vocal about it by saying it to the rest of the team as well, so that good effort is recognized and rewarded. Humanize the message. As I said, the best leaders are those who put a sense of togetherness and who offer empathy, especially during times when health is involved and endangered. Explain decisions. This is very tricky because a lot of the times leaders make decisions just because they have a certain information in their head and because they think that is the right way to do it. Not explaining the decision to the people makes you a manager. It means that you are somebody who just says, we will go in this direction, and from tomorrow, these are your tasks, and that's it. That is a manager. There's nothing wrong with that when it's an operational thing, but in times of a crisis, the leader is somebody who actually explains why the company will do something, why each of you will do these or those things, and why we've chosen this course of action. Explaining the decisions, at least to some extent, helps reinforce trust and helps people to feel like they are part of the business rather than just executing orders or doing as told. outline next steps. Especially in times of crisis, it's important to give that next step. So we will do A, B, and C, but the next steps, if things go well from, say, next week or next month, will be these and these and these. So this also helps people map out in their head the journey that the organization needs to go through in order to come out from the crisis and to get to a better time. And follow up. This doesn't happen a lot during a crisis because there is a lack of time, but a follow-up is extremely important because it again helps people understand why they did something and why it was needed to be done, and how well did they do it, because that helps them again in the long run to be more responsive for the next time. And now we're going to share some examples of concrete business leaders during COVID-19 crisis that showed good or bad behavior and that we can learn from for sure. The first example is an example of a leader who leads with empathy. As I mentioned before, empathy is part of the emotional intelligence and part of a good leadership skill set because it really does have a major impact on those people who are involved. So Kevin Johnson, who is the CEO of Starbucks, wrote this in the email that went out to the employees. He said, "As I write to you on this beautiful spring day in Seattle, I'm reflecting on the fragility of the human experience. 6 months ago, who could have predicted the world would be united in a common cause, overcoming the human impact of COVID-19, the loss of life, feelings of isolation and loneliness, concerns about health and fears of economic uncertainty. But here we are, navigating this together. During times of adversity, values are tested. I remain inspired by your resilience, and I am optimistic that together we can overcome this challenge. Words cannot capture the immense pride and gratitude I have for you, my Starbucks partners, as you demonstrate support for one another, your customers, and the thousands of communities we serve." So for some of you, it might seem that this is a cheesy email and nobody would believe this. You wouldn't imagine how big of an effect this can have if it comes from somebody that is ranked as high as Johnson, who is the CEO of Starbucks. Even if it means that you don't believe that he truly means every single word he wrote, the whole experience of having an empathic email like this one sent out to the stakeholders, it's a big difference. So never underestimate the power of a kind word, never underestimate the power of empathy, and never underestimate the power of humanizing your message, because you're ultimately addressing people. Even if they are your employees, vendors, customers, they're still people. So this was very well received, and it really is used as a good example. Now, this example is something close to my heart, actually, because I've watched this particular CEO deliver this message in the video message that he sent out to the employees. I don't work for Marriott, but I've seen it on the social media. And this video really brought tears to my eyes because it was really clear that this person was sincere, felt very bad about delivering bad news, but still held it together, knowing that it is his responsibility to do it. So this is an example of being courageous and honest with bad news. As I said before, being a good leader in good times is a no-brainer. It's very easy. Being a good leader in bad times is extremely difficult. And you, as a leader, have the sole responsibility to deliver the bad news. We're going to see later how some people avoided the accountability of delivering bad news. But this particular CEO, who's called Arne Sorensen, and he's the CEO of Marriott Hotels. I'm sure you know this chain of hotels. And in this video message, he said, "COVID-19 is like nothing we've ever seen before. For a company that's 92 years old, that's borne witness to the Great Depression, World War II, and many other economic and global crises, that's saying something. But here are the facts. COVID-19 is having a more severe and sudden financial impact on our business than 9/11 and the 2009 financial crisis combined. In most markets, our businesses is already running 75% below normal levels. The restrictions on travel and required social distancing is having an immediate impact by depressing demands for our hotels. I did not put the entire message here, but what he ended up saying is that he needs to actually let go a certain level of people. I think it was something between 20 or 30% of employees being let go. And he actually said this was sometime in springtime when COVID was still, let's say, starting. We didn't know how long will it last. But he said that for that month, both him and all of those who are on the highest management level will give up their salary in order to cover somehow the losses that were incurred during this time. So this was obviously an extremely difficult decision. Obviously, he had to make a decision that had a very, very negative impact on many people losing their jobs. But he was courageous enough to explain the decision, say it, deliver the message, and take accountability and say that, this is happening. I am sorry, but this is what needs to be done. And then obviously offering some kind of an effort to show his own empathy by giving up a portion of his income in order to cover the losses. Then sometimes symbolic gestures matter a lot. What we've seen during this year is that since things were so bad, even the smallest acts of kindness made a big impact. So this was something that was recognized by a leader called Dan Glaser. He's the CEO of Marsh & McLennan. And he said, I want to say to all of you that while we are in the thick of this global pandemic, your job is secure. There will be no counting of sick days or vacation days until things return to normal. Obviously, this was done sometime in the springtime. I'm not sure how long he lasted with this policy of not counting the vacation days or sick days. But at least for that time, for a month or two, this gesture made a big difference because people at least felt that something is, a positive side, and that their CEO or their leader is recognizing their hardships in some way and trying to help them in a small way, at least with this gesture, which means a lot to some. And again, being responsible and accountable for the bad news. As I mentioned with the Marriott CEO, delivering bad news takes a lot of courage, and you need to be accountable and responsible for it because you're the one who is the decision maker. If you are the leader, you are the one delivering the news. So Henry Ward, who is the CEO of Carta, actually wrote in the email saying to his employees, if today is your last day, there is only one person to blame, and it is me. This had to be done after announcing to 161 employees that they were being let go. Even though he had no choice but to do it, he at least said that he's the one that is doing it and they should blame him, and that he's sorry because even though he didn't want this to happen, that's the price of being a leader. That's the price of being a CEO. That's the price of having a high position and being in power, where you have to be responsible for not just the good stuff and the success, but also for the bad stuff and for the bad news. Now, a bad example of dealing with bad news is a smaller company that is called Bird. And they produce electric scooters. And what they did was they left it to an anonymous executive to deliver the news that 30% of the staff will be losing their jobs in a 2-minute Zoom call. The thing was also that the workers had a 1-hour notice to join the call, where they were informed by somebody completely anonymous that they will lose their job. And those people who missed the call or who didn't have a chance to join learned that they were let go just when they were starting to access their email. So there was no other way of informing them that they are no longer part of the company, but they were just logged off of their email, and that was a signal to them that they no longer have a job. As you can see from many angles, this is a very bad example of leadership in a crisis or at all, and a bad example of dealing with bad news. Then we have, again, emotional intelligence and showing compassion as a good leader. Brian Chesky, who is actually the CEO of Airbnb, I'm sure most of you know Airbnb as the company that is in the hospitality business and that helps with the accommodation. And obviously they got hit very hard this year because the tourism and travel was very much restricted and still is. In one of his messages, he says, "I have a deep feeling of love for all of you, and I'm truly sorry. Please know this is not your fault." He did demonstrate compassion in this message. But other than that, he also demonstrated this compassion through his actions. When he announced that the company was laying off 25% of the staff, he offered generous benefits for those who were leaving, including reorienting most of the company's recruiters to help those that were laid off to find new jobs. In a sense, this is a very good use of resources, and at the same time, I'm sure that it really helped a lot to those people who suddenly found themselves jobless and who probably used this help from the recruiters to find a new job, hopefully. So again, dealing with bad news really shows if you are a good leader or not. And then recognizing the opportunity to do something good. As I said in the beginning, a crisis is a danger and an opportunity. So Patrick Collison and Reid Hoffman, who are Stripe CEO and the LinkedIn co-founder, they actually took advantage of the current reality to push historically rigid industries forward at actually lightning speed. What they did was in April 2020, they launched something called Fast Grants. And this this is a foundation that approves grants for COVID-19 research within 48 hours. By May, they reviewed over 4,000 proposals and awarded more than $125 million to 127 research teams. For those of you who might not know this, in the academic world, typically grant making process takes years. This actually speed up things so much that they were able to do something good. And obviously, this particular crisis pushed so many industries and so many companies to change those things that they kept postponing to change for many years, especially, for example, considering work from home, digital strategy, online presence, etc., etc. So there is good in the crisis, and there is a positive outcome at the end of the day for some cases, which just means that we need to recognize it and push for it to make something good out of a bad situation. And then lastly, as I mentioned already, being flexible and adaptable. A good leader cannot expect a stable behavior of the company or a stable environment. And they absolutely need to always have in mind that they need to be flexible to the situation. So what happened in this year is that a lot of the companies were faced with something unprecedented, which was leading home office employees. Before 2020, I think that many companies were offering this as an extra benefit or as something that can be done occasionally from case to case, where, you know, if you need to stay home for one day, you can work from home and they allow you to do it. But this year, all of a sudden, so many companies actually were forced to send their employees home and to have home office employees. So not only was it a challenge for the leaders to organize all of this, but also to continue business as usual and to lead these people who are no longer sitting 2 feet from them, but who are sitting in their home, and to lead them in the virtual way. The policy of social distancing and isolation actually made this a norm. And even today, we are almost at the end of the year, we still have people working from home now regularly. There's several reflections about the role of leaders in managing remote employees during these difficult times that was actually brought up by this situation, and the leaders actually had to adapt their leadership behavior, because if they didn't, they would be faced with with issues with task completion, performance assessment, and employee engagement or motivation. So a good leader in this crisis was supposed to recognize that he or she has to send his or her employees home, that they work from home, and find new ways and be adaptable in order to lead them in the best way possible, still keep them engaged, and still kind of keep an eye on things if they are happening well or if they are completing their tasks. And that's actually all of the examples that I have. Lastly, as a conclusion, I just want to mention that the ongoing crisis has once again reminded everyone about the critical role that leaders and leadership play in dealing with unexpected events threatening the existence of organizations worldwide. Um, you have to understand that leaders of any kind receive an increased amount of attention and scrutiny during any crisis, especially during these challenging times, because people expect them to provide guidance, comfort, hope, accurate information, sense of direction, etc., etc. So it's all up to them, and these leaders are um, the ones who define the reality for their businesses. So they have a major responsibility on their head. And as a last kind of guideline or guiding principles to have in mind when leading during a crisis would be ensuring business continuity as a priority, leading with the heart and the head. So not just making sure that you're doing the right thing for your business, but also being empathetic and also being also humanizing the message so that you lead with the heart. Aim for speed over perfection, always. In times of crisis, perfection is the enemy, so always aim for fast decisions and soon. And then lastly, look for opportunities in the emerging new normal. I'm very hopeful that in the next year we will see many new ideas shine to light because of 2020. And I'm hopeful to see many leaders that will shine because of all the hardships that they've faced in 2020 and dealt with them in the best way possible. And I'm sure that all of these things will actually turn out to be opportunities once business is more or less back to normal and the crisis is towards the end. That's all from my side. I want to really thank you for your attention and for taking the time to listen to this webinar and to learn something new. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat box. And obviously, if you have any other questions regarding EduEffective, feel free to contact them at info@edueffective.online. And also you can check the website EduEffective for any new courses or new knowledge or new lectures on management, leadership, etc. And I'm sure you will find many useful information there and many useful courses, webinars, and similar materials to learn from. Once again, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to share this knowledge with you. I'm looking forward perhaps to seeing you again in some other event, and in the meantime, I wish you health and safety and happy holidays that are coming up in a few weeks. So thank you very much, and take care.